After all these years, I've learned that the truth a person tells isn't always in the words they say. Sometimes the real story, the gut-wrenching, honest-to-God truth is hiding in the fantasy. It's tucked away inside the most outlandish, unbelievable narrative you've ever heard. Because sometimes reality is just too damn painful to look at head on. I remember the day I got the pitch for Mark's story. A 2-year-old man married with 2 kids, a suburban house, and one very big claim: he was in regular communication with an extraterrestrial intelligence. The producers were buzzing. It had all the hallmarks of a ratings grabber, the kind of segment people would talk about around the water cooler. The labels were already flying: delusional, crazy, a grifter, a man having a psychotic break. His wife, Sarah, was desperate. His brother, Kevin, was angry. They saw a man who had completely checked out of his life, abandoning his responsibilities for a fantasy he'd constructed in his garage. And on the surface, that's exactly what it looked like. I've seen it 100 times. A person creates an alternate reality because the one they're living in has become unbearable. But with Mark, something felt different from the moment I read the file. There was a strange sort of logic to his delusion, a consistency that hinted at something deeper than just a simple break from reality. This wasn't a man trying to get famous. This was a man trying to survive. When he walked out onto my stage, he didn't look like the wild-eyed fanatic you might expect. He was neat put together. He had the soft, slightly lost look of a man who used to be in charge of things but had long since forgotten what that felt like. He was an engineer, I'd read, an aerospace engineer of all things, a man who dealt in physics and certainties and the black and white of numbers. And now he was living in the deepest, fuzziest gray imaginable. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him, coiled like a spring. You could feel the years of frustration, fear, and love all warring inside her. She wasn't looking at a case, she was looking at the man she'd married, the father of her children, and she was watching him drift away into a galaxy she couldn't reach. I started off easy. I always do. Mark, I said, looking him straight in the eye. Tell me what's going on. I didn't ask if he talked to aliens. I didn't challenge him. I just opened the door and he walked right through it. He spoke calmly, methodically, like an engineer presenting a technical report. He talked about the transmissions, the patterns he discovered in cosmic background radiation using a ham radio and a modified oscilloscope he'd built himself. He described the beings not as little green men, but as a non-corporeal intelligence, a consciousness that communicated through complex mathematical sequences and tonal frequencies. He called them the Weavers because they showed him how everything in the universe was interconnected. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't trying to sell me anything. In his mind, he was simply stating the facts as he knew them. His brother Kevin, sitting in the audience, was about to explode. I could see it. The clenched jaw, the shaking head. To him, this was nonsense, a pathetic excuse for his brother's failures. And Sarah, she just looked tired, so incredibly tired. She told her side, how Mark had lost his job 2 years prior, how he'd withdrawn, stopped looking for work, and started spending all his time and their dwindling savings on his project. How he'd wake her up in the middle of the night, excited about a clear signal, oblivious to the foreclosure notice on the kitchen counter. Her story was the one everyone in the audience understood. It was a story of financial ruin, of emotional abandonment, of a family in crisis. His story was from another world. My job wasn't to decide which story was true. My job was to figure out why the second story had become necessary for him to write. Because I can tell you right now, nobody chooses a reality that costs them, their family, their home, and their sanity unless the reality they're leaving behind is 100 times worse. The aliens weren't the problem. They were the solution to a problem he couldn't name. And I had to give it a name. So we started peeling back the layers. You don't get to a place where communicating with a non-corporeal intelligence from another galaxy seems like a viable career path overnight. That's a destination you arrive at after a long, painful journey down the wrong road. We went back to 2 years ago to the day he was laid off. Mark had been a lead engineer on a project for a major aerospace contractor. This wasn't just a job for him, it was the culmination of his entire life. This was a man who, since he was a boy, found comfort in schematics and the elegant certainty of physics. His father, also an engineer, had raised him on a diet of logic and high expectations. Success wasn't just hoped for, it was the baseline requirement for approval. Love and validation in his childhood home were often tied to achievement. You solve the problem, you get the praise. You fail, you get silence. And for an engineer, there is nothing more terrifying than a problem you cannot solve. His project, a satellite communication array, had its funding abruptly pulled. It wasn't his fault. It was a budget cut, a corporate decision made by people in a boardroom 1,000 miles away. But for a man whose self-worth was welded to his professional success, the why didn't matter. The result was the same failure. They didn't just take his security badge, they took his identity. He walked out of that building not as Mark, the brilliant engineer, but as Mark, the unemployed 40-year-old with a mortgage and a family he now felt he couldn't provide for. The silence he'd feared from his father as a child was now roaring in his own head. At first, Sarah said he tried. He sent out resumes, he went on a few interviews, but the industry was tight. The rejections started piling up. Each no was another confirmation of the narrative of failure that was building in his mind. He wasn't just unemployed, he was obsolete. He was a problem he couldn't solve. And that's when he retreated to the garage. It started innocently enough. He was tinkering, going back to his old ham radio hobby. But it was more than that. The garage became his sanctuary. In the real world, in the house, he was faced with Sarah's worried eyes, the mounting bills, his own reflection in the mirror that screamed failure. But in the garage, surrounded by wires, circuits, and soldering irons, he was in control again. He was building something. He was solving problems. This is where the human mind is so fascinatingly adaptive. When faced with a reality that is psychologically unbearable, it will construct a new one. He wasn't failing to find a job. He was embarking on a project far more important than any corporate contract. He wasn't ignoring the foreclosure notices. He was deciphering messages that held the secrets of the universe. The skills that had made him a great engineer were now being repurposed for this grand new mission. He wasn't listening for job offers on the phone. He was listening for patterns in the static between stars. And one day, in that desperate, focused silence, he found one. Or more accurately, his mind created one. It gave him what he was starving for, a purpose. The weavers, as he called them, didn't judge him. They didn't send him rejection letters. They chose him. They affirmed his intelligence, his unique ability to see the patterns others missed. They gave him back his significance. In his conversations with them, he wasn't a failure. He was a pioneer, a conduit, a chosen one. This wasn't psychosis in the classic sense. It was a deeply sophisticated, unconsciously constructed psychological defense mechanism. He had taken the shame of his failure and reframed it into a heroic secret identity. The problem was, this new identity required him to completely abandon his old one, which included being a husband and a father. He wasn't just building a radio, he was building a wall between himself and the world that had hurt him, and his family was on the other side of that wall watching him disappear. The escalation, when it came, was predictable. It follows a pattern I've seen time and time again. A family in crisis doesn't just spontaneously combust, it's a slow burn. It starts with concern, which gives way to pleading, which turns into anger, and finally collapses into desperation. Sarah and Kevin went through every single stage. At first, Sarah tried to reason with him. She'd approach him in the garage, gently trying to connect. She'd talk about the kids, about their future, about the life they had built. She'd ask him, Mark, honey, don't you miss us? And he would look at her with this serene, almost pitying expression and say something like, Sarah, the Weavers are showing me that all of this, the house, the bills, it's just noise. What I'm doing here is for all of humanity. It's so much bigger than us. You have to understand the power of that kind of psychological jujitsu. He wasn't arguing with her, he was invalidating her entire reality. He took her legitimate, terrifying concerns about losing their home and reframed them as petty, materialistic worries. He wasn't the one who was wrong for abandoning his family. She was the one who was unenlightened for not understanding his grand purpose. He had built a fortress of delusion, and every valid point she made, he simply used as another brick in his wall. It was a perfect defense because it was impenetrable to logic. She was speaking English and he was answering in a language from another planet, both literally and figuratively. Then came Kevin. Now, Kevin is a doer. He's a contractor. He sees a problem, he gets his tools, and he fixes it. And he saw his brother as a broken machine. His approach wasn't gentle, it was a sledgehammer. He'd storm into the garage yelling, what the hell is wrong with you aliens? Are you kidding me? You're a 2-year-old man, Mark. Your family is falling apart and you're in here playing with a glorified ham radio. Now, from the outside, you might think Kevin's approach was what was needed, a dose of reality. But you can't scream someone out of a delusion. All that anger did was confirm to Mark what his new belief system was already telling him, that the outside world was hostile, ignorant, and incapable of understanding his truth. Kevin's yelling wasn't a wake-up call. It was just more noise that the Weavers had warned him about. It pushed him deeper into his fantasy, the one place where he was understood, where he was important, where he wasn't a failure. The breaking point, the real point of no return for Sarah, was the money. They had a joint savings account, about $15,000 left. It was their emergency fund, the last buffer between them and total financial collapse. Sarah had been guarding it like a hawk. One morning, she went to pay the mortgage online and saw the balance, $72.14. Mark had drained it, every last cent. When she confronted him shaking with a rage born of pure terror, he was completely calm. He explained that he'd needed to purchase a cryo-cooled low-noise signal amplifier and a specialized atomic clock for time-stamping the transmissions. He spoke about it like he had just bought groceries. He had no concept of the devastation he had just caused. In his mind, he hadn't spent their life savings. He had invested it in the most important scientific discovery in human history. He looked at his crying, terrified wife and genuinely could not understand her panic. That was the moment she told me she finally realized the Mark she had married was gone. The final straw was their daughter's 8th birthday. Lily's one request was for her dad to be there, to be present, not just physically in the house, but with her. Mark promised. The day came, the party was in full swing in the backyard, kids laughing, music playing, and Mark was in the garage. Sarah went to get him 3 times. The first time he said he was on the verge of a major breakthrough. The second time he shushed her, pointing at a line squiggling on his oscilloscope. The third time, when she told him Lily was about to blow out her candles and was asking for him, he just looked right through her and said, they're telling me about the structure of dark matter. He never came out. He missed it. He missed his little girl blowing out her candles. That's when Sarah called my show. Because when the noise in your own head is louder than the sound of your daughter's heart breaking, you are lost in a way that no map can help you with. They weren't coming to my stage for a debate about aliens. They were coming for a rescue mission. When we got to the confrontation on stage, the air was thick. You could have cut the tension with a knife. Sarah and Kevin had laid out their case. It was a compelling narrative of neglect, financial ruin, and emotional abandonment. The audience was with them. They saw a man who had selfishly chosen a bizarre fantasy over his flesh and blood, and now all eyes were on Mark. This is the critical moment. This is where you can't just attack the delusion. If I had gone in there and said, Mark, you're not talking to aliens, you're crazy, and you need to stop, what would have happened? He would have shut down. He would have labeled me, just like he labeled Sarah and Kevin, as another one of the unenlightened. the fortress would have gotten stronger. The aliens were not the problem, they were the symptom. You don't cure the disease by just treating the fever, you have to find the infection. So I didn't talk about aliens, I didn't talk about the weavers. I talked about him. Mark, I began keeping my voice even. I'm not going to debate you on the existence of extraterrestrial life. Frankly, it's above my pay grade. But I want to talk about what this is costing you. Let's set the aliens aside for a minute. Let's just park them over here. I want to talk about your daughter, Lily. I put a picture of Lily up on the big screen behind us. It was from her birthday party. She was standing over her cake, her face a mixture of hope and disappointment, looking towards the garage door. I saw a flicker in Mark's eyes. It was the first genuine crack in his serene, otherworldly demeanor. Tell me about this little girl, Mark, I said. Before the transmission started, what was your relationship like? He hesitated. He started to talk about her in broad, detached terms. She's a good kid, very bright. No, I stopped him. Don't give me the report. Tell me about her. What did you two do together? What made her laugh? He was quiet for a long time. The audience was silent. He was digging back through layers of static and cosmic noise to find a memory. We used to build model rockets. He said, his voice softer, now more human. She loved the countdown. She'd get so excited she'd jump up and down. 10, 9, 8, he trailed off. And now, Mark, I pressed gently. When was the last time you built a rocket with her? He didn't have to answer. His face said it all. The shame was starting to seep through the cracks. He was connecting for the first time in 2 years to the emotional reality of his choices. The delusion was his shield, and I was trying to get him to lower it just for a second to see what was on the other side. I turned to the core of the issue. You were a brilliant engineer, Mark, top of your field. Your entire identity was wrapped up in that, and then one day they took it away from you. Tell me what that felt like. Not what you think it should have felt like, but what it really felt like in your gut on that drive home. He started to deflect. It was a corporate restructuring. No, I cut him off firmly, but not aggressively. That's the intellectual explanation. I want the emotional one. Did you feel like a failure? His jaw tightened. Did you feel like you had let your family down? Did you feel like you had let your father down? Did you feel obsolete, Mark? Did you feel like you were a problem you couldn't solve? Every word was a targeted strike, not at his fantasy, but at the pain that had created it. He started to breathe heavily. His eyes darted from me to the picture of Lily, then to his wife. Sarah was crying silently. The weavers, they tell me, he began a desperate attempt to retreat to his fortress. I'm not talking to the weavers, Mark. I'm talking to you. My voice was sharp now. This was the moment of truth. I'm talking to the father who misses building rockets with his daughter. I'm talking to the husband who used to look at his wife like she was the center of his universe. Where did that man go? Did the aliens take him, or did the shame of losing his job swallow him whole? That was it. That was the breakthrough. His whole body slumped. The mask of the serene prophet crumbled, and all that was left was a heartbroken, terrified 2-year-old man. He started to sob. Not quiet tears, but deep-racking sobs that shook his entire body. It was 2 years of fear, shame, and grief pouring out of him all at once. I failed, he whispered the words, choked with pain. I failed them. I'm a failure. And right there in that raw, agonizing confession was the infection. The aliens were just the fever. The real disease was the profound, crippling belief that his worth as a human being was tied exclusively to his professional success. He hadn't just lost a job. In his mind, he had lost the right to be a husband, a father, a man. The delusion wasn't an escape from his family. It was a self-imposed exile, a punishment for his perceived failure. He had to become someone else, someone monumental, to make up for the fact that he felt like nothing. And in that moment, for the first time in a very long time, he was just Mark again, and he was in a world of hurt. You know, a breakthrough moment on television is a powerful thing. It's raw, it's emotional, and it's what people remember. But it's not the end of the story, it's the beginning. It's like breaking a fever. The crisis has passed, but the patient is still weak, still sick, and the real work of healing is just getting started. Mark's confession on that stage, I failed them. I'm a failure, was him finally putting down the alien detecting equipment and picking up the mirror. And what he saw in that mirror terrified him. The outcome of a story like this is never a simple, tidy bow. Life isn't a sitcom where a heartfelt conversation solves 2 years of trauma in 22 minutes. For Mark, the path forward was going to be a long, difficult climb out of a very deep hole he had dug for himself. The first step was getting him the right kind of help. This wasn't something a single conversation could fix. He was dealing with a profound depressive episode complicated by a sophisticated delusional framework. He needed intensive individual therapy to deconstruct the narrative he'd built around his failure. He needed to learn from the ground up how to separate his self-worth from his job title. That's a lesson a lot of folks, particularly men of his generation, are never taught. They're taught to provide, to achieve, to produce, and when that ability is taken away, they don't know who they are. They feel like a machine that's lost its function. We also got him into family counseling with Sarah, because while Mark was lost in his own galaxy, Sarah was left to navigate the very real world of bills, single parenting, and the slow motion grief of losing her husband while he was still living in the same house. There was anger there. There was resentment. She loved him, no doubt about it, but love doesn't pay the mortgage. She had been hurt deeply. She had been ignored. She had to find a way to trust him again, and he had to earn that trust back one small earthly act at a time. The counseling wasn't about the aliens, it was about the abandonment. It was about him learning to listen to her fears without deflecting them, and her learning to see the terrified man behind the delusion. Kevin, his brother, had to learn a new way of communicating too. His sledgehammer approach, while born from a place of love and frustration, was just making things worse. He had to learn that you can't shame someone back to health. He had to learn to support his brother's recovery, not just demand his immediate return to normal. It meant backing off, giving him space to heal, and offering encouragement instead of ultimatums. I followed up with them 3 months later. The change was not miraculous, but it was real. Mark had dismantled the entire setup in his garage. He told me the silence at first was deafening. For 2 years, that static had been his companion, his purpose. Now, it was just an empty room. He was seeing a therapist twice a week. He described it as learning a new language for his own feeling. He was starting to identify the shame and the fear that triggered his desire to retreat. He and Sarah were talking again, really talking. There were hard conversations, there were tears, but they were communicating in the same reality now. He hadn't found a job yet. The idea of going back into the high-pressure world of aerospace engineering was still terrifying for him. The fear of failing again was palpable. His therapist was working with him on this, helping him see that a layoff is an event, not a definition of his character. Instead, he took a part-time job at a local electronics repair shop. It was humble, it wasn't glorious. He was fixing TVs and computers, but it was something. He was using his hands again, solving small, tangible problems. He was contributing to the household, even in a small way. He was rejoining the human race. The most poignant part of the follow-up for me was a story Sarah told. One Saturday, she found Mark in the backyard with Lily. They had a model rocket kit spread out on the grass. They were building it together. She said she stood at the kitchen window and just watched them for half an hour. She saw her husband teaching their daughter how the fins stabilize the flight, saw Lily's face light up as she painted the body red and silver. It wasn't about discovering the secrets of the universe. It was about discovering how to be a father again. Did he still believe he had spoken to aliens? It's complicated. When I asked him directly, he got this far-off look in his eyes and said, I believe I was very lost, and I needed to believe that someone somewhere thought I was important. And that right there is the truth of it all. The weavers, the transmissions, the complex mathematical sequences, it was all a beautifully constructed metaphor for a very simple, very human need, the need to matter. He didn't need to be a chosen emissary for an alien race. He just needed to be a chosen father for a little girl who wanted to build a rocket with him. He was trading a fantasy of cosmic significance for the real tangible significance of being present in his own life. And that's a journey worth more than a trip to the furthest star. The story doesn't end there, of course. Recovery isn't a straight line. It's a jagged one with peaks and valleys. 6 months after the show, I got a call from their producer. There had been a setback. It wasn't a full relapse into his alien narrative, but it was a significant wobble. Mark's part-time job at the repair shop had ended. The store had downsized, and he was the last one in, first one out. It was another layoff. Small, insignificant in the grand scheme of the economy, but to Mark, it was a seismic event. It was a direct echo of the initial trauma that sent him spiraling in the first place. Sarah said for about a week he went silent. He didn't retreat to the garage. The equipment was long gone, sold to help pay off some of the debt he'd accumulated, but he retreated into his own head. He'd sit in the living room staring at the television without seeing it. He stopped engaging in his therapy sessions. All those old feelings of worthlessness and failure came rushing back. The narrative he and his therapist had been so carefully deconstructing was threatening to reassemble itself. The temptation to find a grander, more palatable explanation for his pain was immense. It's so much easier to believe you're a misunderstood genius on a cosmic quest than it is to sit with the raw, mundane feeling of being a 2-year-old man who just got laid off from a repair shop. This is the critical test, not the big dramatic breakthrough on a soundstage, but the quiet, lonely moments when the old demons come knocking. This is where the work truly happens. Sarah, armed with the new tools from their family counseling, handled it differently this time. She didn't plead or get angry. She didn't try to fix it. She simply sat down on the couch next to him, put her hand on his, and said, "I'm here. This is hard, and it's okay to be scared, but you are not alone in this room." She didn't try to argue with the feelings of failure. She validated the pain while rejecting the conclusion. She was anchoring him to reality, to their shared reality. And then Lily, in that way that kids sometimes have of cutting through all the adult nonsense with a simple, profound truth, came in and handed her dad a piece of paper. It was a drawing. On it were 2 stick figures, a big one and a little one, holding hands next to a rocket that was blasting off towards a smiling moon. At the top, in wobbly letters, she had written, "To the Moon Dad." She didn't care about his job title or his income. She cared about her rocket-building partner. That was his value. That was his purpose. It was written in crayon. That was the moment that pulled him back from the edge. It wasn't a voice from the stars. It was a drawing from his daughter. It was the realization that his worth wasn't something that could be given or taken away by a corporation. It was something that existed in the hearts of the people who loved him. He had been looking for significance in the vast, empty void of space when all along it was right there in his living room. He went back to his therapist the next day. He talked it all through, the shame, the fear, the echo of the past trauma. But this time he didn't invent a new reality to escape it. He faced it. He owned the feeling. And by owning it, he robbed it of its power. He started looking for work again, but with a different perspective. He wasn't just looking for an engineering job. He was looking for a way to contribute. He started doing some freelance technical consulting, small projects he could do from home. It wasn't the 6-figure salary he once had, but it was his. He was building something again on his own terms. The final chapter for me came about a year after the show. I received an email. It was from Mark. There was no mention of aliens or weavers. It was a short, simple note. He told me he was coaching Lily's robotics club at her elementary school. He said they were building a small robot for a state competition. He wrote, "I used to think I needed to solve the mysteries of the universe. Now, I'm just trying to figure out the gear ratios for a robotic arm that can pick up a plastic block. And you know what, Dr. Phil? It feels a hell of a lot more important." That right there is the whole story. He didn't just get better, he got wiser. He learned that significance isn't about the scale of your achievements, but the depth of your connections. He didn't need to communicate with a distant, non-corporeal intelligence. He needed to learn how to communicate with his wife and his daughter. He was looking for patterns in the stars, but the most important patterns were the daily rhythms of a family that loved him. He traded a grand, lonely fantasy for a messy, complicated, beautiful reality. And in doing so, he didn't just come back to earth, he finally came home. His journey wasn't about aliens, it was about what it means to be a man, a husband, and a father when the world tells you you're no longer useful. And he found the answer not in the static of the cosmos, but in the sound of his daughter's laugh.